I buried my only son on Tuesday, and on Wednesday, I heard my daughter-in-law laughing about how she would finally get rid of me and send me to a nursing home. She didn't know that my son had left behind a plan, a little secret that would turn her smug smile into pure panic. But to help you understand the depth of this betrayal, I'll start the story from the very beginning. When my son Daniel passed away, my world came crashing down. He was only in his 40s, my only child, and the kind of man who could take a bare patch of dirt and turn it into a garden that made you stop in your tracks just to stare. He had an eye for beauty like his father once did, and hands that were never afraid of hard work. To me, he wasn't just my son. He was my heart walking around outside my body. And now, just like that, he was gone. I was 69 at the time, though I felt 100 that morning. Grief has a way of making your bones ache worse than arthritis ever could. I sat in that chapel, the scent of lilies too sweet, almost cloying, while the pastor droned on about Daniel's life well lived. I wanted to shout that his life hadn't been lived nearly enough, that there were weeds in my garden older than the years he'd been given. But I stayed quiet, clutching my tissue like a lifeline. Beside me sat Clara, my daughter-in-law of nearly 2 decades. Perfect Clara. Not a hair out of place, her black dress pressed within an inch of its life, her face painted just so. She cried delicately into a lace handkerchief, and people around us whispered about how strong she was, how graceful. A grieving widow straight out of a magazine. I'll admit I believed it too. After all, grief shows itself in many ways, and I thought maybe her composure was her way of holding it together for the children, James and Sophie. For myself, I couldn't hold anything together. I was unraveling, a knot of sadness and disbelief. When the service ended and folks began milling about, shaking hands and murmuring their condolences, I felt like I was moving through fog. People's lips moved, their hands pressed mine, but I couldn't really hear them. My ears were filled with the pounding of my own heart. After a while, I excused myself. Truth be told, it wasn't just the grief. I needed to take my arthritis pills. My knees had been complaining louder than the church organ that day, and if I didn't take my medication, I'd be hobbling worse than usual. I slipped out into the hallway, my cane tapping lightly against the polished floor, and made my way toward a quiet corner near the restrooms. That's when I heard it. Clara's voice. It was lighter, sharper, almost bubbling with relief. "Thank goodness this is almost over," she said, her tone bright in a way that didn't match the black she was wearing. I froze, hidden behind the corner, my pill bottle clutched in one hand. Her friends tittered softly, and then Clara added, "Now I can finally get rid of that burden. She's going exactly where she belongs, in a retirement home." The laughter that followed was like nails on a chalkboard. My knees nearly buckled, and not from the arthritis. I gripped my cane so tightly my knuckles turned white. A retirement home? A burden? She was talking about me. In that moment, I nearly dropped the pills I'd come out to take. My heart stuttered like it wasn't sure whether to keep beating. For years, I had thought Clara and I shared something close to family love. We'd laughed over dinners, celebrated birthdays together, cried when Daniel got his diagnosis. I thought she'd been my partner in holding the family together. And now, here she was, mocking me in whispers and plotting my eviction before Daniel was even buried in the ground. I can't explain the mix of emotions that crashed over me in that instant. Shock, hurt, disbelief. A part of me wanted to march right around that corner and give her a piece of my mind. Another part of me wanted to crawl back into the chapel and curl up beside Daniel's casket, because how on earth was I supposed to live in a world where my only son was gone and the woman I thought of as a daughter wanted to throw me away? Instead, I did neither. I straightened my spine, took a deep, steadying breath, and tiptoed back toward the service without letting them know I'd heard a word. My pills rattled softly in my pocket, forgotten. Sitting back down, I looked at Clara with new eyes. She dabbed at her face with that handkerchief, offering me a delicate squeeze of my hand as if to say, "We'll get through this together." And for the first time in years, I didn't believe her. My son's funeral was supposed to be the saddest day of my life. It was. But it was also the day I learned the truth. The person I thought was family saw me as nothing more than dead weight. And let me tell you, dear, there's nothing like betrayal at a funeral to put a little steel in your spine. That night after the funeral, I lay in the guest bedroom staring at the ceiling fan turning lazy circles, the shadows sliding across the walls. My mind wouldn't rest. Every time I closed my eyes, Clara's voice came back to me. Burden. Retirement home. The word stung worse than the arthritis in my knees on a rainy day. I couldn't help but replay the years we'd spent together, this time with sharper eyes. When my husband Robert passed away, it was sudden. A heart attack in the garden he loved so much. One moment he was trimming the rose bushes, the next he was gone. 40 years of marriage, over in a blink. I was lost, sitting in that empty house, the rooms too big and too quiet without him. Daniel and Clara came over right away. I remember them standing in my kitchen, Daniel with his arm around her shoulders, both of them talking to me as though they'd rehearsed it. "Mom, it doesn't make sense for you to rattle around this house all by yourself," Daniel said gently. Clara chimed in, her voice syrupy sweet. "You'd be happier with us. We've got plenty of space. And if you sell the house, we can put the money towards something bigger, something that gives us all security." At the time, it sounded sensible, almost comforting. The idea of being surrounded by family instead of rattling around in that old creaky house alone seemed like a blessing. And truth be told, the money was tempting. Nearly $300,000 once the house sold. More money than I'd ever seen in my life. So I did it. I signed the papers, packed up Robert's and my life into cardboard boxes, and handed the money to Daniel and Clara. They used it to expand the garden design studio Daniel had been pouring his heart into, and to buy a bigger house. "An investment for all of us," Clara said with a smile. At the time, I believed her. I thought we were building something together. For years, I told myself I was lucky. I had a roof over my head, my grandkids nearby, and the satisfaction of knowing I'd helped support Daniel's dream. But lying there that night, Clara's cruel laughter ringing in my ears, the memories began to shift. I started seeing things I brushed off before, like the way she sighed when I asked for help setting up my new phone, as though I'd asked her to build me a rocket ship, or the way she scheduled family dinners on the same nights as my bridge club, then acted disappointed when I said I already had plans. "Family should come first, Martha," she'd say, making me feel guilty for wanting one evening with friends. And the grandkids, James and Sophie, how I cherished them. But even there, Clara had control. Visits were always supervised, as if I might corrupt them with too many cookies or stories about their father as a boy. "Too much excitement isn't good for their routine," she would say. I told myself she was just being protective, but looking back, it felt more like she was keeping me at arm's length. I also remembered the little looks. When my arthritis slowed me down getting into the car, I'd catch her rolling her eyes. When I brought up Robert, she'd change the subject quickly, as though my grief was inconvenient. I convinced myself she was just stressed, just tired, just human. But that night, with the truth out in the open, all those little slights lined up in my memory like blinking neon signs. I realized I had been living in their house not as family, but as a tolerated guest. The money I gave, the years of love, the trust, it all felt like I'd been handing her bricks to build a wall between us. And now that Daniel was gone, Clara no longer needed to pretend. I reached for the old quilt folded at the foot of the bed, the one my mother had sewn from scraps of dresses long gone, and pulled it tight around me. It was a small comfort, but it reminded me that once upon a time, people in my life cared for me without condition, without calculation. I stared at the ceiling fan until dawn, my heart heavy but my mind clearer than it had been in years. In the weeks before Daniel passed, there was a moment that had been tugging at the back of my mind ever since the funeral. We were sitting together in his bedroom, the afternoon light streaming in through the curtains. His voice was weak, but his eyes were steady when he reached out and squeezed my hand. "Mom, don't worry. I've made arrangements." At the time, I thought he was talking about the service, flowers, hymns, maybe what kind of sandwiches to serve afterward. I nodded and told him not to fuss over those things, that I'd handle it. I had no idea then just how much weight those words carried. When the day came to gather at Mr. Kent's office for the reading of Daniel's will, I was still lost in grief. I wore my plain black dress, the same one I'd worn at Robert's funeral years before. Clara, on the other hand, arrived looking like she was about to take charge of a board meeting. Sharp pantsuit, expensive-looking heels, a designer bag hanging from her arm like a badge of power. She was polite but brisk, ushering James and Sophie into chairs as though we were all actors in a play she was directing. Mr. Kent, a small man with thinning hair and glasses that always slid down his nose, shuffled his papers with great care. He'd been Daniel's lawyer for years, but I'd only ever seen him once or twice. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice gentle. "I know this is a difficult time, but Daniel was very specific in his wishes, and it's my duty to honor them." I folded my hands in my lap, trying to steel myself. Clara sat beside me, her expression calm, though I could see her fingers tapping against her thigh under the table. I don't know if she realized she was doing it, but it was a steady rhythm, tap, 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 like a drumbeat of impatience. Then Mr. Kent cleared his throat. "First, regarding the family residence and the design studio." He glanced at his papers again before continuing. "Daniel transferred both properties into a family trust 3 years ago. His mother, Martha, is named trustee, with the right to live in the residence for the remainder of her life. Upon her passing, both properties will be inherited equally by James and Sophie." I must have blinked 3 or 4 times, trying to process what I just heard. I was trustee? The house, the studio, they were protected? Clara, on the other hand, went pale as fresh linen. She shifted in her seat, her lips parting slightly, and for a moment she looked like she'd forgotten how to breathe. Mr. Kent went on as if he hadn't noticed. "As for financial assets, Daniel's retirement accounts and savings are to be divided as follows. 60% will go into a trust for James and Sophie's education and future needs, with Martha as trustee, 20% directly to Martha for her care and maintenance, and 20% to Clara." The air in the room seemed to thicken. Clara's hand clenched around that monogrammed handkerchief she carried everywhere. 20%? She said finally, her voice tighter than the waistband of my Sunday skirt after Thanksgiving dinner. "That's all." Mr. Kent didn't flinch. "That is what Daniel directed. He was very clear." I sat there stunned, my heart caught between sorrow and gratitude. Daniel had known. Somehow, even while fighting his illness, he had seen further down the road than I had. He had protected me, protected his children, in a way I hadn't even realized I needed. Clara's face, though, that was something I'll never forget. Her carefully crafted composure cracked. A flush crept up her neck, and for a second, I thought she might actually leap across the table. But instead she leaned back stiffly in her chair, her knuckles white where they gripped that handkerchief, and pressed her lips into a thin, furious line. I didn't smile, though part of me wanted to. Instead, I lowered my eyes and whispered a silent thank you to Daniel. That little whisper I'd almost forgotten, "I've made arrangements," now rang in my ears like a church bell. For the first time since his passing, I felt something besides grief. I felt relief. Clara did not take Mr. Kent's words as a cue for dignity. By the time we got home, she had a plan and a fresh coat of lipstick to match it. Within a week, she hired a high-powered attorney named Victor Hale, the sort of fellow whose suit looked like it came with its own security detail. Papers arrived by courier with a thump that rattled my teacup. A petition to contest Daniel's will. According to Clara and Victor, my son hadn't been in his right mind. Imagine that, Daniel, who could spot a diseased elm from across a parking lot and still remember my grocery list, suddenly too foggy to sign his name. It didn't stop at legal filings. Clara started a campaign that would have impressed a mayor. At the market, at church, at the garden club, wherever 2 people could stand and whisper, she told anyone who would listen that I was not myself. Slipping. Paranoid. Forgetful. She said I misplaced checks and repeated stories. Well, I do repeat stories. Some of them are worth hearing twice. But the way she said it turned ordinary aging into a caution sign with my name on it. The worst part was how it seeped into my own kitchen. James and Sophie came home quiet and careful, like they were walking on marbles. "Grandma?" James asked, standing in the doorway with his backpack still on. "Are you okay?" I said of course I was, then offered cookies because that is a grandmother's version of a notarized statement. He managed a smile, but I could see the worry. Children know when the air has changed, even if they don't have the words for the weather. I tried my best to carry on. I labeled the pantry, wrote notes to myself on cheerful yellow cards, and kept a little log by the back door listing the day's chores. Truth be told, I've always liked a list. But every ordinary stumble, misplacing my glasses, forgetting where I set down the pruning shears, started to feel like evidence in a trial I hadn't agreed to attend. It was as if I were being erased in pencil, softly, steadily, while everyone watched and nodded. Out of sheer desperation, I called my oldest friend, Helen. We met in 9th grade algebra. Two girls sharing one pencil and a dislike of variables. Helen had gone on to become a judge before she retired, and she still had the voice that could quiet a room without raising a decibel. I told her everything, Mr. Kent's reading Clara's filings, the whispers piling up like junk mail. She listened without interrupting, which is Helen's way of underlining. Martha, she said finally, you need counsel who knows your rights and isn't afraid to use them. Then she gave me a name, Sandra Patel. She's sharp. Elder law is her garden. Let her weed it. Sandra's office smelled faintly of lemon oil and bravery. She wore sensible shoes and a calm expression, and she took notes with a fountain pen that made the prettiest scratch on paper. I handed her the stack of documents, my little logbook, and the letter I'd written to myself the night the rumors started, just so I wouldn't forget how it felt. She read quickly, then looked up with steady eyes. This is elder financial abuse, plain and simple, she said. And we're going to fight. I can't say my knees stopped aching, but something inside me stood a bit taller. Sandra explained what the contest meant, what deadlines we faced, and how we'd answer. She spoke in plain language, not Latin, and she never once patted my hand like I was a houseplant. We mapped out tasks. Gather medical letters about Daniel's clarity, collect my records, list witnesses who'd seen me run a household with more order than a library cart. I was a librarian after all. Dewey Decimal may be retired in some places, but in my pantry it thrives. By the time I left, I had a folder, a plan, and the kind of steady resolve that tastes like strong tea. Clara had declared a war I didn't want, but I knew two things for certain. My son had known exactly what he was doing, and I still knew exactly who I was. One evening, I walked past Daniel's old office and caught Clara crouched over his desk. She was rifling through drawers with the urgency of a raccoon in a compost bin. When she saw me standing in the doorway, she jumped and slammed the drawers shut so hard the lamp rattled. Just organizing some paperwork, she said, her voice tight, her smile thinner than phyllo dough. Then she brushed past me and disappeared down the hall in a cloud of expensive perfume. I may be a grandmother, but I wasn't born yesterday. Clara had the look of someone digging for buried treasure. And if there was treasure in that office, I figured it belonged to Daniel's children and not to her designer handbags. Later that week, she announced she had a business dinner. That phrase had become her favorite lately. Business dinners in silk blouses, business dinners with fresh manicures, business dinners that left her coming home hours after any respectable dinner should have ended. She left in a hurry, clicking down the walkway in those heels that sounded like little hammers. The house was quiet again. Just me and the hum of the refrigerator. My curiosity, and truth be told my suspicion, got the better of me. I took my cane, marched back into Daniel's office, and began my own search. At first I found the usual. Pens that didn't work, old tax folders, a dried-up rubber band that had melted into the shape of a question mark. But then at the very back of the bottom drawer, I noticed a stack of tax papers that sat too high, like there was something beneath them. With a little effort I pulled the stack out, and there it was, a small gray lockbox. The kind that looks like it might contain either something very valuable or, knowing Daniel, a stash of old seed packets. My hands trembled as I lifted it out. It wasn't locked, just closed with one of those flimsy clasps. I took a deep breath, unclipped it, and opened the lid. Inside, neatly stacked and organized, were documents. Financial records showing transfers Clara had made. Money siphoned from their joint accounts into her own private one. There were travel receipts too, flights and hotel stays that made no sense. Daniel hadn't been well enough to travel during those times, and I knew those charges weren't from family trips. My heart sank, though I wasn't exactly shocked. Somewhere deep down, I think I'd suspected Clara's business dinners were less about networking and more about company she wouldn't have wanted Daniel to know about. Then I saw a small digital recorder tucked into the corner. My heart pounded as I pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the room, weaker than I remembered but unmistakably his. "Mom," he said. "If you're hearing this, it means Clara's mask is off. I started keeping records because I knew something wasn't right. She's been hiding things, making plans that don't include us. Protect yourself and protect the kids." I pressed pause and sat there staring at the recorder. My Daniel, my thoughtful, quiet, steady Daniel, had known. He had carried the weight of his illness, the weight of running a business, and on top of that, the knowledge that his wife was plotting behind his back. And still, he had found the strength to think of me, to leave behind a trail of breadcrumbs so I wouldn't be blindsided. I went through the rest of the box carefully. There were emails printed out, bank statements highlighted in Daniel's neat handwriting, and more recordings, conversations Clara must have had in the house, unaware Daniel had switched on the recorder. The woman who had sat beside me at the funeral dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief sounded cold and sharp when she thought no one important was listening. I closed the box and pressed my palms against the cool metal lid, feeling both grief and relief. Grief for the betrayal Daniel had endured. Relief that he had trusted me enough to leave me the truth. That little lockbox was heavy when I carried it out of the office, heavier than its size should have allowed. But it wasn't just paper and a recorder I was carrying. It was Daniel's final gift. His way of reaching out to protect me and his children even after he was gone. And I knew right then that Clara had picked the wrong old woman to underestimate. The day of the hearing, I felt like I was marching into battle, though instead of armor I had a sensible cardigan and my cane. Clara strutted into the courtroom as if she owned the building. She wore a black suit so sharp it could have sliced bread, her hair pulled back tight, her lips painted the color of dried roses. She didn't look like a grieving widow. She looked like she was about to announce quarterly profits. Her lawyer, Victor Hale, was right beside her, exuding the kind of smug confidence that comes from billing by the minute. Across the aisle I had Sandra, calm as a stone but with a little smile at the corner of her mouth, the kind that said she had an ace tucked up her sleeve. I clutched my handbag on my lap and whispered a little prayer to Daniel. Judge Ramirez presided, a woman with silver streaks in her hair and a gaze that could stop traffic. She asked us all to be seated and began by reviewing Clara's claims, that Daniel had been confused, too ill to understand what he was signing, that I had somehow manipulated him into rewriting his will. I kept my face as still as I could, though inside I wanted to roll my eyes so hard they'd end up behind the bench. Sandra stood, collected and steady, and began presenting the documents from the lockbox. The room was quiet except for the sound of papers sliding across the polished wood. She laid out the transfers Clara had made, the receipts from hotels, the highlighted bank statements. Then she brought out the little recorder. When Daniel's voice filled the courtroom, soft, tired, but clear as day, every head turned. "Mom, if you're hearing this," his voice said, "then Clara's mask is off. Protect yourself. Protect the kids." For a moment, even Victor Hale shifted in his expensive shoes. Clara's face froze, her lips pressed so tight together you'd think they were glued. But Sandra wasn't finished. "Your Honor," she said, her tone as smooth as butter on Sunday pancakes, "we also have a witness." That's when Marcus walked in. Clara's jaw dropped so fast I thought we'd need a broom to pick it up. Marcus looked sheepish, his tie crooked, like a man who wished he were anywhere else. He avoided Clara's eyes as he took the stand. Under oath, he admitted what Sandra already knew. He and Clara had been seeing each other for nearly 2 years. She had told him more than once that once Daniel passed, the two of them could start over with the money and the business. The entire courtroom went silent. You could have heard a paperclip drop. Then Clara lost her composure. She shot up from her chair, pointing at Marcus with a trembling finger. "You traitor!" she hissed, her voice echoing against the wood-paneled walls. Judge Ramirez banged her gavel. "Mrs. Harrison, control yourself or you will be removed from this courtroom." Clara sat back down, shaking with fury, her cheeks blotchy with rage. Marcus kept his head down, confirming the details of his trips with her, the conversations about money, even the comments she'd made about putting me in a home. Each answer was another nail in the coffin of Clara's case. By the time Sandra sat down, Clara looked like a statue about to crack. Victor tried to salvage what he could, but it was like trying to scoop water with a fork. The judge's face said it all. When the hearing wrapped up, Judge Ramirez announced that the will stood exactly as Daniel had written it. The trust was valid, my role as trustee was confirmed, and Clara would receive only the portion Daniel had intended. As we stood to leave, Clara shot me a glare that could have curdled cream. I simply adjusted my cardigan, tucked my cane under my arm and thought, "Daniel, you clever boy. You really did make arrangements." Once the gavel came down and Clara's case collapsed, life shifted quickly. She packed her designer luggage and moved herself right out of the house. The story going around was that she was starting fresh in Las Vegas with Marcus. I nearly laughed out loud when I heard it. Fresh. More like stale bread left out on the counter. Within months, word trickled back through mutual acquaintances. She and Marcus had parted ways. No surprise there. He wasn't cut from the innit for the long-haul cloth, and Clara had never been one to thrive without an audience clapping for her. The whole affair fizzled out faster than a 4th of July sparkler. She still calls the children on birthdays and holidays, chirping brightly into the phone like nothing ever happened. Those calls are short, polite, and awkward, like two strangers making small talk in a grocery line. She asks James about school, Sophie about art projects, but she never digs deeper, never listens long enough to hear the real answers. She doesn't visit, and honestly, the kids don't seem to mind. James was 13 when his father died, and now at 15 he's taller than me, with Daniel's same steady eyes. Somewhere along the way he picked up a camera and discovered he has a gift for seeing the world differently. He told me once that taking pictures makes him feel like he's holding on to pieces of his dad. The way light filters through leaves, the way shadows stretch across the lawn at dusk. He says those are the kinds of things his father would have noticed, and capturing them is his way of keeping that connection alive. He even set up a little darkroom in the basement, which smells permanently of vinegar now, but I don't complain. Sophie, now 12, has blossomed into her own creative force. She spends hours at the dining room table sketching and painting. Buildings, gardens, whimsical little worlds that look like they could spring right off the page. She's got that same spark Daniel carried in his bones, the ability to see beauty where others see nothing. I often find her with smudges of paint on her cheeks, humming to herself while she works. I keep extra tablecloths in the drawer just for her masterpieces in progress. We've also been to therapy together. At first, James was reluctant. He said he didn't want to talk feelings with a stranger. Sophie was quieter, keeping everything tucked inside. But over time, those sessions gave us space to air out the heaviness, to talk about losing Daniel and about the fractured trust with their mother. It wasn't easy, but little by little we've stitched ourselves into something whole again. Not perfect, but whole. Our home has grown into a place filled with love, laughter, and the kind of ordinary chaos that feels like healing. There are shoes by the door, art supplies on the table, half-developed photographs hanging from lines in the basement, and the sound of children's voices echoing through the rooms. Even without Daniel, we've managed to build something warm and steady together. Sometimes, when I'm sipping tea on the porch and watching James line up a photograph while Sophie sketches beside him, I can almost hear Daniel chuckle. I think he'd be proud of us for surviving, for carrying his spirit forward, and for proving that love, once planted, can keep blooming even in rocky soil. 2 years have gone by, and I often catch myself looking around this house with a kind of astonishment. This was the very place Clara once called too big for an old woman. She pictured me tucked away in some sterile retirement home, probably fed canned peas on a plastic tray. Instead, here I am, surrounded by family, the walls filled with laughter, and the house in Daniel's beloved studio secured for James and Sophie's future. It turns out Clara was right about one thing. The place is too big for just me. That's why it's perfect for 3. Clara lost her grip on everything she thought she controlled. The marriage gone. The business she assumed would fall into her lap gone. And saddest of all, even her children's trust slipped through her fingers. She calls now and then with that same overly bright voice, the kind people use when they're trying too hard. But there's no real connection, and the children don't yearn for one. She traded family for power, and in the end she got neither. Meanwhile, I've gone and surprised myself. I joined a book club at the library where I used to work back in the day. At first I was nervous, thinking I'd just sit in the corner while everyone else debated modern fiction. But it turns out I've got plenty to say, and folks actually listen. We meet every other Thursday, and I never leave without a new story or a fresh laugh tucked in my pocket. Sophie coaxed me into painting alongside her. I started out just dabbing at watercolors, making clumsy flowers that looked more like spilled tea stains. But she cheered me on anyway, telling me every mistake was just art being playful. These days I can manage a decent little landscape, though I'll never hold a candle to her talent. It's less about the result and more about sitting at the table together, brushes in hand, chatting about everything from homework to the shapes of clouds. And then there's Frank. I met him at the local history society. He's a widower who spends his weekends cataloging old photographs and talking about the past like it's still right in the next room. We started sharing coffee after meetings, and before long, he had me laughing so hard I nearly spilled cream down my blouse. It's not romance so much as companionship, though I won't deny he makes my heart feel lighter. After years of loss and betrayal, it's nice to have someone look at me and simply see Martha, still standing, still living. Life feels fuller than I ever expected at my age. The days have a rhythm now. Mornings tending the little herb patch Daniel started. Afternoons spent ferrying Sophie to art classes or cheering James at his school exhibits. Evenings reading or painting or simply enjoying the quiet. I'm not wealthy by the world's standards, but I'm rich in all the ways that matter. And sometimes when the house is still and the children are off in their rooms, I think about Clara's words, how she couldn't wait to get rid of me. The irony never fails to make me smile. She was so certain she'd win, yet she's the one who ended up packing her bags, leaving behind the very life she thought was hers for the taking. They say living well is the best revenge. Well, I'm living proof. Every sunrise with the children, every brushstroke on canvas, every laugh over coffee, it all feels like victory. And the sweetest part is I didn't have to fight dirty to get it. I just had to hold on long enough for the truth to bloom.
Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have kept quiet after hearing Clara's plan, or confronted her right then and there? If you liked the story, subscribe to the channel and give us a like.